Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The top global story we have been tracking all week. US President Donald Trump has opened the floodgates for a tariff war with the imposition of reciprocal tariffs on all nations. As a part of his Liberation Day economic plan, President Trump has levied maximum retaliatory import duty on several nations. China, Vietnam, EU, Japan and India all feature on Trump's extensive list. Trump also said that tariffs for pharma sector are under review and will come in at levels never seen before. From anger and outrage to emergency meetings, Trump's tariffs evoked a slew of reactions across the world. China accused the US of using unilateral bullying practices and imposed 34% tariff on all goods imported from the USA. Canada has already responded to Trump's measures with tariffs of its own. The North American country has imposed duties of 25% on US imports worth $30 billion. Similarly, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has warned that the EU was prepared to respond with countermeasures if talks with Washington failed. Let's now talk about India. Trump has imposed 26% retaliatory tariffs on India. He has reiterated that India is a friend of the nation. However, New Delhi has not been treating Washington right. Remember, both the nations have been trying to secure a bilateral trade deal. Sources indicated that the US tariff action may accelerate efforts to conclude the free trade agreement between India and the European Union. We have learned that ministers from both sides will be holding a phone conversation within the next few days. We're now joined by Christine Bliss, President of the Coalition of Service Industries, the organization dedicated to enhancing the global competitiveness of the US service sector. This is an industry body that represents major American companies like MasterCard, Disney, Visa, Amazon, Microsoft, Walmart, Google, and others. Christine, thank you very much for joining us once again on Global Eye. This really hasn't been good news for the American industry, has it?
It is not. We continue, my members continue to face continuing uncertainty as to how all of this will unfold. We were very disappointed we knew it was coming, but we were disappointed with the announcement and the level of tariffs that were imposed, both the across-the-board tariffs and the individual country tariffs. Needless to say, it is causing a considerable amount of business uncertainty in terms of planning, future planning, supply chain disruptions, and simply what this will mean. Will it mean a real attempt to try and force U.S. companies to reshore their operations back into the United States? And how much energy will be spent in actually negotiating trade agreements that would secure the removal of tariff and unfair tariff barriers, which would be a benefit certainly to my members and to U.S. industry.
Right. I'd like to ask you about the impact of the U.S. services sector specifically. What do you foresee?
Well, as I said, the immediate impact, as is the case across the business community, is a great deal of uncertainty, and also the fact that many of our major trading partners and close allies have been hit with tariffs, and also on a business-by-business basis, we're waiting to see what the individual reactions will be about existing business relationships and operations. But clearly, there is going to be an impact on supply chains as long as these tariffs are in place. And then, of course, the retaliatory measures that have been announced by the Canadians and by the Chinese. It's not clear the degree to which they will directly reach services. Some of my services companies are also manufacturers, so they can be impacted by some of the tariffs directly on goods. But to the extent that others, such as the Europeans, who have so far held back and not imposed retaliation, they at least have indicated that they would consider the possibility of imposing tariffs on services. So that's something that we're very concerned about. And also, I think we're looking for immediate declines in level of business, whether it's in the travel and tourism sector, whether it's the increased burdens and costs on distribution services, whether it's the increased burdens and costs on logistics services, will be very immediate. Because one of the things that you didn't mention in your introduction was that the president also ended, with respect to China, the de minimis exception for goods of a small value, and also indicated that over the long term, that exception would be ended for all nations, but that will depend on a determination of when the U.S. and its customs border is able to actually administer something like that. So that's going to be an added burden, especially to small business suppliers. And then finally, what we're looking at is whether it will chill investment into the United States, which is a very important source of employment, and certainly for service suppliers and others.
Okay, let me ask you about your appeal to the Trump administration. And do you even think, Christine, that these tariffs are well thought through?
Well, I do think that there was a considerable amount of thought that was put into it and debate. I think we in business were aware that certainly President Trump has a large group of advisors that were giving him various options to consider. And so, yes, I think they thought about them. I think it's just what they seem to feel was most important in the long run. And from the president's own statements, that seems to be trying to convince U.S. business to reshore onto the United States. It seems to be to also, as he feels, create an unfairness in the balance of tariffs between nations, and also feels the importance about raising revenues. So I think to the degree that those objectives were thought about, yes, they were well thought through.
All right. When it comes to India, India has a lot of services export to the United States. And with the emphasis of the administration on manufacturing in the U.S., reshoring operation, creating jobs in the United States, how do you think the services export from India to the U.S. is going to be impacted?
Well, I think, again, I would turn immediately to the disruption in supply chains. I think if you look, for example, in the semiconductor industry, where India has a very large part to play, whether it's software development, research and development, I think to the degree that there are tariffs put on individual products that are part of that supply chain, price increases, and thoughts about whether there has to be any reshifting, rejiggering of those supply chains, there will be an impact directly. I think similarly, with respect to logistics, there will also be an impact very directly, particularly over the long term, as the de minimis exception goes away. I think other than that, really the future depends on whether there is a serious engagement and negotiation between the U.S. and India to negotiate a full free trade agreement, which would be what we would favor, that would include the removal of digital and services barriers. And that we would see as ultimately very beneficial. And let me just remark and go back to your previous question briefly, which is to say, well, I said I think yes, the tariffs were thought through in terms of the objectives that I mentioned, which I understand are those of the president's. I think from our perspective, what does seem to be downplayed and ignored are the recessionary impact, the inflationary impact that they're going to have the longer they're in place. And that we're very concerned about.
Okay, my final question to you would be about the progress in India-US trade negotiations. Now, we have been negotiating a trade deal for about a month. Last week was 5-7 days of intense negotiations, probably too early to come to any sort of deal. But what is your assessment as an industry veteran who has been engaged with the government through several advocacy and policy programs? Where do you think the hurdle lies in India and US coming to an agreement? When the president says India has agreed to give far-reaching concessions to the US, but we'll still impose reciprocal tariffs, why is that happening according to you? And what is US looking for at this juncture, which has not been arrived at?
Well, I think a major emphasis has been on tariffs, and probably tariffs in the agricultural area in particular. And I think from our perspective, the negotiations need to broaden into services and digital, because that's where you will see significant progress along with the lowering of the industrial tariffs. Things like data flow restrictions and data localization barriers and non-discriminatory treatment in the tax area and treatment of our electronic service suppliers in terms of their ability to supply their services. And I'm talking about things like credit cards and having access to credit. And so I think that, you ask about major hurdles. I think that getting agreement that it should be a far-reaching agreement is going to be a bit difficult, but one that we think is incredibly important, and really to strengthen geopolitically and commercially the relationship between US and India.
All right, Christine Bliss, thank you so much for joining us with your view, with your reaction to the reciprocal tariffs and the kind of disruption, the chaos it's going to throw in for businesses worldwide. We're going to take a short break here on Global Eye, but coming up on the other side, US President Donald Trump's tariff blitz has rattled stock in commodity markets across the world. We will be joined by Rosenberg Research's Bhavna Chabra on the other side. Stay tuned.